Evet. Herkese yeniden merhaba. Bu oturumda size Katrin Malabou'nun bir konferansını sunacağız. Katrin Malabou bir filozoftur ve halen Birleşik Krallık'ta Kingston Modern Avrupa Felsefesi Merkezi'nde tam zamanlı olarak öğretim üyesi olarak çalışmaktadır. Paris Nanterre Üniversitesi, Kaliforniya Üniversitesi'nde uzun süre ders vermiştir. Birçok Anglo-Sakson üniversitelerinde de çalışmıştır Birleşik Devletler'de. Ve özellikle Hegel üzerinde çalışıyor ve bize de Hegel'den yola çıkarak geliştirdiği, yani geliştirilen plastisite kavramından söz edecek. Derrida'nın yakın çalışma arkadaşıdır ve eğer Cogito dergisinin Derrida sayısına bulabilirsiniz. 2006'daydı zannediyorum. Derrida'nın İstanbul'a gelişi dolayısıyla çıkan bir sayıydı. Orada ilk makale Katrin'e yazdığı bir mektuptur. Ve önemli bir mektup, bir yolculuk üzerine ve bir de Türkiye'deki dil değişikliği, Atatürk terimleri vesaire üzerine enteresan bir yazıdır. Şimdi size Katrin'e söz vereceğim. Konuşmasını İngilizce olarak yapacak. Daha sonra da sorular olursa bunlara devam ederiz.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me, and good afternoon. So I will give this presentation in English, and it's about Freud. What I will present is a reading of his text written in 1929, which is Beyond the Pleasure Principle, in which he introduces the death drive. So the question, in fact, the title Beyond the Pleasure Principle is in fact a question. Freud is asking, is there anything beyond the pleasure principle? This is a question he addresses to psychoanalysis, that is also to himself. Why this question? Very early in his work, he said that the pleasure principle is the very law of the psychic apparatus. It is a homeostatic tendency inherent to the psychic apparatus to maintain the quantity of excitation present in it as low a level, or at least at constant a level as possible. Freud assumes very early that this principle governs and masters all psychic events. And in the beginning of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, he says, I quote, "In the theory of psychoanalysis, we have no hesitation in assuming that the course taken by mental events is automatically regulated by the pleasure principle. We believe, that is to say, that the course of events is invariably set in motion by an unpleasurable tension, and that it takes a direction such that its final outcome coincides with a lowering of that tension, that is, with an avoidance of unpleasure or a production of pleasure." So this is the pleasure principle. Our psychic apparatus seeks to maintain the energy as low and constant as possible. If it is true that this principle governs our psychic apparatus, why then is it necessary to inquire whether there would be something beyond the pleasure principle? Why is Freud asking, after having stated that this was the fundamental law of the psyche, why is he asking at the end of his life, is there anything beyond this pleasure principle? That is there something in our psyche that seeks to escape the pleasure principle's legislation? And we know what it is. We know what this beyond the pleasure principle is. In the same text, Freud will give it a name. This is the death drive. So the death drive would be another principle, in a way, that go beyond the pleasure one. The death drive, Freud finally says, is the name of what goes beyond the pleasure principle. So how does he characterize this drive? He says every living being departs exactly from inorganic matter. It therefore returns to it when it dies. With the appearance of life, he says, the first instinct came into being, the instinct to return to the inanimate state. So we would have a tendency, our psychic apparatus would have a tendency to go back to this inorganic matter. I quote again, this inanimate state must be an old state of things, an initial form which the living entity has at one time or other departed. All living beings, Freud concludes, are striving to return to that previous state. A last quote, if we are to take it as truth that knows no exception, that everything living dies for internal reasons, becomes inorganic once again, then we shall be compelled to say that the aim of all life is death, and looking backward, that inanimate beings existed before living ones. So the death drive is this tendency to return to the inorganic state. This is why Freud comes to the conclusion that there exists in life two tendencies, the life drive, as you know, and the death drive. Freud comes to such a conclusion when he takes into account the problem of traumatic neuroses. Some unpleasant traumatic experiences obviously generate a kind of return which does not seem to coincide with the pleasure principle. For example, he says, after several mechanical concussions, railway disasters, other accidents involving a risk of life, the patients look to be traumatized, and their psyche seems to be governed not by the pleasure principle, but by the death drive. In traumatic neuroses, the accident, the situation of fright, tend to repeat themselves, mostly in dreams. I quote from Freud, dreams occurring in traumatic neuroses have the characteristic of repeatedly bringing the patient back into the situation of the accident, a situation from which he wakes up in another fright. So, such dreams after a trauma seems to contradict Freud's earlier conclusion in his book on dreams and their interpretations. As you know, earlier Freud had said that a dream is the accomplishment or fulfillment of a desire. So dreams are obeying the pleasure principle. But after a trauma, when people dream, on the contrary, these dreams don't seem to fulfill a desire. On the contrary, they repeat the same anxiousness, the same fright, the same incapacity to have pleasure. So does that mean that there is something else than the pleasure principle in the psyche? And Freud comes to the conclusion that yes, there's something else than the psyche, which is, as I said, the death drive. And this death drive first appears as the compulsion to repeat. There would be something in the psyche that seeks to repeat again and again and again, something which is traumatizing and not pleasurable. That's why Freud says, I quote, we shall find courage to assume that there really exists in the mind a compulsion to repeat which overrides the pleasure principle. And he says we have courage, we should have courage to affirm that, because he is contradicting himself in a way. Because for years he had said that the pleasure principle was the only principle in the mind. And now he says, no, there's something else, which is this compulsion to repeat. And he says again, if a compulsion to repeat does operate in the mind, we should be glad to know something about it, to learn what functions it corresponds to, under what condition it can step forward, and what its relation to the pleasure principle is, to which, after all, we have hitherto ascribed dominance over the course of the processes of excitation in mental life. So now he wants to know what is the relationship between pleasure and death, between pleasure and the compulsion to repeat. What goes beyond and comes back, thanks to the compulsion to repeat, is again the threat of death that takes the form of the pure neutrality and indifference of inorganic matter. By pure neutrality, I mean a state of being which is neither life nor death, but their common past, and in this sense, their similarity. So at the end of the book, Freud tries to characterize what exactly is the compulsion to repeat, which brings the psyche to face its own death again and again and again. And then, and here is my problem, when Freud comes to characterize the death drive, he uses two different adjectives, elastic and plastic. He says the death drive is both elastic and plastic. So at times he says elastic, at other times he says plastic. He uses the two adjectives as synonyms, as if they meant the same thing. Or it is a problem because the two adjectives don't mean the same thing. Plasticity and elasticity are two mechanisms or forces that are irreducible to one another. What is the main difference between them? A plastic material, once shaped, cannot go back to its previous state. For example, the sculpture, the marble, once sculpted, cannot go back to its previous state. On the contrary, an elastic, when you let it go back to its initial shape, it loses the shape. It can come back to its initial shape. It's a bit more loose, but it comes back to an initial shape. So this ambiguity, is the death drive plastic or elastic, is for me a big problem. Does it mean that when the psyche returns to inorganic matter, it is like an elastic? Are we inhabited? Is our psyche inhabited by an elastic movement, like we come back to an initial state without any form, we lose the form? Or is something like a formation in this return? Do we return to inorganic matter in shaping this return? And I will try to show how this question is in fact fundamental for clinic and for the problem of trauma. So I will tell you a little bit more about Freud's uses of the two adjectives, elastic and plastic, elasticity and plasticity. Plasticity for Freud in other texts characterizes what he calls the indestructibility of our earliest psychic formations. The idea appears very clearly in a text which is a bit anterior to Beyond the Pleasure Principle in Thoughts for the Times on War and Death. In the development of the mind, Freud says, I quote, every earlier stage persists alongside the later stage which has arisen from it. Here, succession also involves coexistence, although it is to the same materials that the whole series of transformations has applied. The earlier mental stage may not have manifested itself for years, but nonetheless, it is so far present that it may at any time again become the mode of expression of the forces in the mind. This extraordinary plasticity of mental developments is not unrestricted as regards directions. It may be described as a special capacity for involution, for regression, etc. But the primitive stages can always be re-established. The primitive mind is, in the fullest meaning of the word, imperishable. So sorry for this long quote, but what Freud says here is that the first form of our psyche, what he calls the primitive mind, which is the first conflict which shapes our psyche, never disappears. It can be repressed, it can be hidden, it can be transformed into later stages, but in itself it never disappears, which means that the psyche never loses its form. So that's why it is said to be plastic. Once formed, Freud says, the psychic matter cannot go back to a previous state. So it means that if we follow that idea, the death drive is a return to the inorganic, but if it is plastic, it means that this return to the inorganic is itself a form. We return to the inorganic through a form, through the form of our first psychic imprint. So, on the one hand, it is very clear that according to Freud, even if there is something like this tendency to go back to in an inorganic matter, this tendency to go back is at the same time possible only because we have a form, only because the psyche is able to keep its form. So, on the one hand, it seems that there's no death drive without plasticity. That's why Freud has this very interesting remark in Beyond the Pleasure Principle, in which he says that each of us, I quote, only wishes to die in his own fashion. We all have our own fashion to go back to inorganic matter. Each of us has their own form of death. So the death drive is the same for all of us, but the way in which we return to the inorganic matter is absolutely peculiar to each of us because we keep the first form of the psyche. So this return is plastic. But as I said, at the same time, in the same text, Freud seems to contradict this affirmation by using the word elasticity or elastic. I quote, always Beyond the Pleasure Principle, he says, the death drive also appears as, I quote, a kind of organic elasticity, or to put it in another way, the expression of inertia inherent in organic life. So at other times, he seems to admit, to state on the contrary, that the return to the inorganic matter, the Beyond the Pleasure Principle, is simply a destruction of the form. It is our psyche functions as an elastic which erases all forms and just comes back to matter without any form. So how are we to understand the death drive and the Beyond the Pleasure Principle? Do we access death through a form? Do we have of each of us a form of death? Or, on the contrary, is death to be understood as just the annihilation of all form? According to me, Freud cannot really solve the problem because he cannot admit that perhaps the death drive means that destruction is always a form. He wants to explain that. He's striving to give us examples of what a form of death might be, but he fails. If you remember well, in the last chapters of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, he asks, do we have an example of what the death drive is? And he fails. I quote, the difficulty remains that psychoanalysis has not enabled us either to point to any instincts or drive other than the libidinal forces. The problem is that he wants to admit that there is something beyond the pleasure principle, the death drive. But the problem, as he says, is that he cannot give examples of that. He says every time we want to take an example of what the drive is, we always have the libidinal, that is the pleasure principle example. We cannot, and this has been the nerve of the critique that has been addressed to Freud. What is the death drive? It does not exist because Freud is not able to give an example of what a form of death is. What is it that the psyche is able to form its own death? Freud says we have the idea, but we don't have the examples. Every time we want to take an example, these examples always belong to pleasure. That's why he says the only example I can give is sadism. From the very first, I quote, we recognize the presence of a sadistic component in the sexual instinct. As we know, it can make itself independent and can, in the form of perversion, dominate an individual's entire sexual activity. So the example he gives of a form of death is sadism or masochism. In fact, the psyche would die out of its own sadism or masochism against itself. Okay? So to go back to this inorganic matter through a form would be to become a sadic of oneself in a way, or a masochist. But he's not pleased with these examples, again, because these examples pertain to pleasure and not to the death drive. These examples still have something like the life drive in them, the sexual drive. So he's not satisfied with his own discovery. He admits that there's something beyond the pleasure principle, that it is the death drive, but he cannot give us an example of what it is. Sadism and masochism are still derived from love, this is what he says. And so they proceed from the transformation of love into hatred, but they proceed from love, and so they are not good examples. So sadism and masochism ultimately are and can only be forms of pleasure. So, in the end, the conclusion of the book is very disappointing, because we started with the very interesting idea that death is plastic, that destruction has its own form, that our psyche forms its own death, and in the end, we only have an opposition between the plasticity of life drives and the elasticity of death drive. In the end, Freud comes to the conclusion that there is no plasticity of death, that in fact it is life which is plastic and death is only elastic. And this is a very disappointing conclusion within the same text. Freud seems to say two different things, contradictory things, in the same text. The problem for me is that this point of view, like the elasticity of the death drive, is challenged by the reading of certain contemporary neurobiologists, like, for example, Antonio Damasio, who shows that cerebral diseases are precisely form creations, that death, when it comes from trauma in the brain trauma, brain lesion, that death is always a formation. It's not an elastic. When a personality is impaired by a brain damage, this lesion gives way to a new person, to a new form. That's why Damasio compares the trauma, the brain trauma, to a theater, to a play. He compares the traumatized people to Beckett's characters. They all have a form. So, changes caused by cerebral lesions frequently manifest themselves as unprecedented metamorphoses of the patient's identity. So what Damasio shows against Freud is that, again, when the trauma happens, the personality changes. That is, something like a new form appears, which paradoxically, precisely, is the form of death, and this form of death has nothing to do with pleasure. This is why he compares the brain patients to Beckett's characters. A person with Alzheimer's disease, for example, is not an elastic. It is not someone who is returning to an inorganic state. It is not either a form of, it is not either an example of sadism or masochism. It is something else. It is not an elastic, and it is not an identity which owes anything to pleasure. This identity is a new form. The subject has become someone else, and this form is precisely that of the death drive. Damasio shows that all lesions that impact the cerebral mechanisms for producing and regulating the emotions, particularly in the prefrontal cortex, can alter the personality to such a degree that it becomes unrecognizable without necessarily diminishing the higher cognitive functions, language, memory, attention. So some patients, even if they can still reason, speak, remember, become emotionally impaired And this change in personality designates such a change that the wound which causes it constitutes a dividing line between the before and the after the trauma. Cerebral traumas are there to be regarded as plastic power. There is a fragmentation of the identity, and from this fragmentation, a new form of being appears. And definitely, the contemporary neurology of emotions shows that brain traumas act as plastic surgery, even if it is out of destruction. That, again, cerebral lesions are not an elastic return to a previous state of things, but the plastic formation of a new identity. Which means that clearly the wound has plastic action upon the psyche. And perhaps cerebral lesions are the examples which Freud needed. Instead of turning himself toward sadism and masochism, he could have taken these examples of cerebral lesions which alter the emotions. Let's recall that the term plasticity has three main significations. Firstly, it designates the capacity of certain materials, such as clay or plaster, to receive the form. Clay is said to be plastic because you can sculpt it. Secondly, on the contrary, it designates the power to give form, the power of the sculpture or the plastic surgeon. So plasticity is also the act of giving a form. And finally, it also refers to the possibility of the explosion of every form. In French, when we speak of plasticage, it means bombing, exploding. So what is interesting in that term is that it is situated at both extremes of the creation of forms and the destruction of forms. This is what allows me to affirm that a destruction can be a form, that there is a formation out of destruction, and that it is precisely what happens in the brain after a lesion. Again, wounds, traumas, or catastrophes are not creators of form in the positive sense of the term. It is not the sculptural paradigm of the beautiful form. It is a form creation out of, again, the destruction of form. When the form is destroyed, it creates another form, a new form, which is the form of death. Such plasticity, that is the lethal plasticity, the plasticity of death, remains an adventure of form. And then it would be interesting to rewrite Freud's conclusion, the last chapters of Beyond the Pleasure Principle, and affirm that the death drive is not elastic, but plastic. What people, again, I take this example again, what people with Alzheimer's disease show us is precisely the plasticity of the wound, through which one identity is forever dislocated to form another identity, which in turn neither constitutes the sublation nor the compensatory replica of the old form, but rather literally a form of destruction, a psyche which, in a sense, is born out of its own destruction. They prove that destruction is a form which forms, that it is a form that might constitute a form of psychic life. The formative destructive power of the wound, as we are attempting to think it now, could thus be articulated in this manner: all suffering is formative of the identity that endures it, and death itself is a formative process. And I think we can affirm that for Freud, that is in his place, and for him. I mean, we can give him the example that he was looking for. This hypothesis of destructive plasticity, and I come now to my conclusion, and I hope we can discuss this problem. The hypothesis of destructive plasticity, therefore, calls into question something that Freud believes very strongly, that is the continuity of personality in pathology. It could be that there is no relation between the identity of the subjects that come before and that which comes after a lesion or trauma. Perhaps after a lesion, the two persons are not the same, which is a contradiction to what Freud states. You remember he says the psychic form, the first form is indestructible, but perhaps it is not. Perhaps we can have several forms during our lives which don't have any continuity between them. The new identity is perhaps unprecedented, and this is perhaps what death is, to become a form of oneself which has nothing to do with the previous one. Perhaps this kind of new form is the one that Damasio characterizes as the cold form. The death drive would be coolness, what he calls. He very often comments on the capacity of certain people, certain brain patients, to act in cold blood as if they were becoming totally indifferent to themselves. I quote from Damasio just an example of one of his patients. So after a brain lesion, he says, his emotional life seemed impoverished. Now and then, he might have a short-lived burst of emotion, but for the most part, such display was lacking. There is no sign that he felt for others, no sign of embarrassment, sadness, or anguish at such a tragic turn of events. His overall affect is best captured as shallow. So he described this patient as shallow, that is cold, indifferent, etc. And he characterizes this new identity as a cool one, that is an indifferent one, which is, according to me, this form of death, which has nothing to do with the previous identity. So we have here an example of an identity formed by destruction, which has nothing to do with pleasure. I think we have an example of what can be the beyond of the pleasure principle. That is the formation of a new identity, the identity of death, which owes nothing to pleasure. In Freud, it seems to me, the dynamic of death and of death shaping remain inarticulated. I think it is perhaps the task of neuropsychoanalysis and of neuropsychiatry to analyze and study such a shaping. Is death a formative process? Does it form a new identity? And study such a shaping in order to be able also to cure traumatized psyches. Most of the time, a damaged elastic remains incurable. On the contrary, a plastic material practically offers, when broken, a possibility of being repaired, even imperfectly. Okay, thank you for your attention.
Catherine Malabou bu konferansında bize Freud'un kuramında önemli bir dönemeç olan haz ilkesinin ötesinde metinden yola çıktı ve psikanaliz için her zaman bir sorun olan ölüm dürtüsü kavramına, sorununa yeni bir yaklaşım getirdi. Burada bunu da Hegel'den aldığı plastisite kavramını elastisite ile karşı karşıya getirerek yaptı. Freud'un yaşam dürtüleri için plastik, ölüm dürtüsü için elastik sıfatlarını kullanmasını eleştirerek bu yaklaşım sonucu biçimin yaratılması ve yıkılması arasındaki plastik çakışmayı anlama olanağının yitirildiğini vurguladı. Plastisite kavramı içinde biçim alma, biçim verme ve patlama, yıkılma anlamlarını içermesinin bir dinamik oluşturması nedeniyle yeğleyen Malabou, biz psikiyat, nörolog ve psikanalistlere bu kavramın yeni tedavi olanakları oluşturmayı düşünmekte yararlı olacağını belirtiyor. İşte Catherine Malabou'nun konferans hakkında sorularınız veya katkılarınız var mı?
Many thanks for this excellent talk. I want to ask you, what about suicide? According to Albert Camus, suicide is actually the real protest of a human being. Is suicide elastic or plastic? That's my question.
Thank you very much, because this is an excellent question and totally relevant for the topic. I would say it's always very difficult to talk about suicide. To interpret a suicide is always extremely difficult. But, for example, I will give you an example, that of Primo Levi, who committed suicide, as you know, at the end of his life. And that there have been two interpretations of this suicide. Some people said he committed suicide because he didn't have any form anymore. He was like an elastic after his experience in the concentration camps, etc. He was absolutely deprived of any identity, of any form. He was exhausted, he was tired, so he committed suicide for that reason. And on the other hand, other people said no, not at all. On the contrary, to commit suicide for him was a way of affirming his own form. Like he was conferring a meaning to his own life. He was doing something that the Nazis prevented him to do. He was, in a way, conquering his own death, the possibility to die. So the example of Primo Levi is really in the middle between a possible elasticity interpretation of suicide as elastic and another one as plastic. And according to me, it's rather the second hypothesis, which is the good one. Thank you for...
Psikanalitik kuramda regresyon kavramı var. Hani bazı kişilerde bir anksiyeteyle karşılaştığı zaman anal döneme ya da oral döneme geri dönüş gözlemliyoruz. Freud'un da bu tam hani tanımlamakta ve sürekli değiştirdiği bu ölüm hazzını bir regresyon ama hani oral dönemin öncesindeki o bilinçsiz döneme, belki sizin anlatımınızda hani inorganik döneme ama daha çok o bilinçsizlik haline bir regresyon davranışı olarak gözlemleme şansımız olabilir mi?
I'm sorry, what should be the regression? Yes, excuse me, yes, okay, now I understand. I missed the first part of your question. If I understand well, because he does not really explain what the first form of the psyche, what he calls the primitive mind, he never exactly explains what it is, but if I understand well, it means the first, it means childhood, it means the childish psyche. The one which is formed in the Oedipian conflict. Okay, so the primitive mind is the first form, which, according to Freud, we never lose, is that one. The way in which we react to the first conflict. So, yes, the regression, death drive is a regression, which means that we return to matter. But at the same time, when he says that the death drive is plastic, he means that we return to inorganic matter, but in our own way. This is what is very difficult to understand. We return to an absence of form, but with our form. That is the way in which we lived the first conflict, is in a way our style. And this is why he says all organisms want to die in their own fashion. So it's a regression, but each of us regresses in their own way. Which means that this return is not the same for all of us. It's not the same form. Is it clear?
Konuşmanız için teşekkür ederim. Biz biliyoruz ki libidoyu biz en çok afekte görürüz, afeksiyonda görürüz. Ve afeksiyon da iki yönlüdür. pozitif libidoyu daha çok örneğin bozulmuş haliyle manide, belki de ölümü depresyonda görüyoruz. Belki bu örnek üzerine de biz haz ilkesinin ötesinde zihin çalışmaları yapabiliriz gibi görünüyor. Çünkü melankolik bir depresyon kendi başına hiç eğer müdahale edilmezse ölüme giden bir süreçtir. Biz bunu artık bu çağda görmüyoruz ama geçmişte bunun yaşandığı olgular olduğunu da biliyoruz. İntihar da biraz önce söylendiği gibi bu depresif süreçlerde çok yaşadığımız bir şey. Belki de ölüm dürtüsünü biz depresyonda daha iyi inceleyebiliriz. İlle de nörolojik defektlerle ortaya çıkan lezyonlar olmadan da görebiliriz. Bu şu açıdan önemli. Bir lezyon, tümöral ya da travmayla oluşmuş bir lezyon dışarıdan gelen bir süreç. Kuşkusuz orada ölümü izlemek mümkün ama dışarıdan gelen bir zedeleyici olmadan da sağlam bir yani bu anlamda defektif bir lezyonu olmayan yapı içerisinde de ölüm dürtüsünü gözlemek için sanki bu daha iyi bir süreç. Bir de afeksiyonun doğrudan zedelendiği şizofrenik süreçlerde yani libidonun taşıyıcısı olan afeksiyon büyük oranda zedelendiği bu şizofrenik süreçlerde de sanki izlemek mümkün olabilir gibi görünüyor. Bilmiyorum katılır mısınız bana?
Thank you very much. Yes, I totally agree with you, and it's a very important question. And as you know, psychoanalysis has never been able, I mean, Freudian psychoanalysis has never been able to cure what we call depression. And perhaps it is because of what you're saying, that these phenomena, which are like this slow return to death in severe depressive cases, this loss of libido, are precisely for me interesting because they are forms of death, which Freud surprisingly never took into account. I think it's only at the very end of his life, when he talks about negative therapeutic reaction, that he notices that some of his patients are not interested in getting cured. Some of my patients don't seem to care about coming to the cure, talking. They are indifferent to therapy. So it means that perhaps, as you say, there is something negative in the libido, but this idea comes very late in Freud's mind. For him, there's only pleasure, or there is death. But that the two may have a plastic relationship is a very complicated question for him. So I think depression is a very good example. Yeah, thank you.
Hi. The previous talk was a critique of the universality claim for compulsive hoarding. I wonder about the universality claim that underlies Freud's both life drive and death drive. I'm not a Freud expert, but in my reading, he seems to be making a very strong universality claim, including in the death drive, right? When he says that we biological organisms are all striving to return to inanimate matter, he doesn't mean that we do this because of our knowledge of the fact that we come from inanimate matter. No. Because otherwise, before that knowledge was discovered, there wouldn't be this drive and so forth. Nonetheless, in terms of the discussion that you presented vis-a-vis plasticity, in the way Freud uses plasticity, do you find just as much reason for the universality claim in his death drive analysis as there is in the pleasure principle and in the life drive?
This is a very, very difficult, very central and difficult question. The universal claim in the pleasure principle is that happiness doesn't mean anything, but what we call happiness is just the avoidance of suffering. So this is the universal claim, that in fact what we call pleasure is just the avoidance of displeasure. And this is a universal law, and our psychic apparatus seeks to maintain this low or constant level of energy which allows us not to suffer too much. This is the universal claim. Then when he asks himself whether there is something beyond the pleasure principle, you're totally right, is making another claim. That is that perhaps he was wrong, that what we're looking for is not that much to avoid suffering, but that there is something in us which tends towards self-destruction. And in the book Civilization in Discontent, he ends up by saying that civilization itself as a whole is self-destructive. So these are quite contradictory conclusions. On the one hand, we seek to preserve ourselves through this avoidance of suffering, and on the other hand, on the contrary, there's this kind of self-destructive return.
It's just some associations that occurred in my mind as I was listening. The idea of plasticity with the three qualities you've mentioned, the ability to take form, the ability to give form, and explosion. These associated in my mind with Wilfred Bion's concept of catastrophic change.
Yes, absolutely.
And to think, the last question you've asked about, to think of all these things as a cure, like a possibility of a curing quality of destructive form. Again comes to my mind the catastrophic change, which is like dying without dying. It is, in Bion's understanding, it is the change that occurs in approximation to noumena, which can be like the inorganic state, the O, which he names O, is the thing in itself, like in Kant's terms. It's the unknowable. And Bion considers always, how do we know? Is knowing possible? He concludes it's not possible, but we can approximate to it. And through transformations, and catastrophic change is a crucial step,
yes,
I would say, in it.
No, this is very, very true. So I'm not a specialist of Bion. You say Bion or Bion?
Bion, psychoanalyst.
Yeah. Yes, I'm not a specialist of his, but I know that he's very important in this domain, and the distinction he makes between the nothing and the no thing is very important. That there's this principle of nothingness in the psyche, which can develop what Freud is stating in Beyond the Pleasure Principle. And I also think of Lacan, of course, and the concept of the real with a capital R. For Lacan, the real is very close to what Bion is articulating. It is what cannot be symbolized. It is what cannot be fantasized. It's the pure presence of trauma. My question, though, is, has psychoanalysis ever been able, and this is also a question for my colleague, has it ever been able to really think beyond the pleasure principle, without, in a way or another, attaching the catastrophic change or the real in Lacan to pleasure in a way or another? To sexuality, to the libido, positive libido? Has psychoanalysis ever been able to really accept that in the mind there is something which has nothing to do with pleasure. I'm not sure that it exists even in Bion and in Lacan, but this is perhaps another. And it seems to me that neurobiology is facing this problem.
Evet, işte tam da bu soruya cevap verebilmek için belki Katrin Malabou çok önemli bir noktada nörolojik bilimlere ihtiyacımız var bu sorulara cevap verebilmek için. Yani sadece psikanaliz kendi içinde kaldığı zaman buralarda cevap veremiyoruz tabii bazı şeylere. Nörolojik bilimler, psikiyatri tabii, psikanaliz ve hatta belki de politik bilimler bunun içerisinde tabii ki bu sorulara verebilmek için. İşte bu vesile bir şey de hatırlatmak istiyorum. Katrin Malabou'nun bir avantajı bizler için sadece bir disiplini bir araya getirmesi değil, Anglo-Sakson ve Fransız felsefesini bir araya getirmesi, bu arada da birçok kitabın, hemen hemen bütün kitapların İngilizceye çevrilmiş olması. Bunlardan bir tanesi, ondan söz edeceğim, ilk kitabıdır. Beynimizde ne yapmalıyız? Bu 2004'te çıktı, sonradan tekrar bastı ve bugün öğrendim ki kendisinden bu kitap bugünlerde Türkçe olarak da yayınlanacak. Bu çok önemli tabii. İngilizce olarak da var bu kitap. Bu kitapta aslında burada bugün çok değinmediğimiz önemli bir kapitalizm eleştirisi getiriyor Malabou. Beynin işleyiş biçiminin kapitalist sistem tarafından bir model olarak alındığını söylüyor. Bir zamanlar ne zaman ki ya da ne diyorduk ki merkezi sinir sistemi, merkezi bir yönetim vardı. Fakat son zamanlarda nörolojik bilimler sayesinde beynin plastisitesinin bulunmasıyla ekonomik modelinde plastisteye uydurulmaya çalışıldığını ve herkesin her işi yapabilir olma hiyerarşi yok artık, değil mi? Şimdiki yeni ekip çalışmalarında önerilen tezler bunlar. Ama bunun kapitalizmin önerdiğini aslında plastiste olmadığı, tam tersine bir elastisite yani fleksibilite olduğunu, yani biçimsizliğe önermiş olduğunu söylüyor. Ve burada bir başka bugün değinmediği bir temel farkın bir rezilyans kavramına, bir dayanma derecesine yattığını vurguluyor. Yani rezilyans bir maddenin baskıya dayanma gücünü tanımlıyor. Madde üzerine uygulanan baskı belli bir dayanma gücünü aştığında çatlar, kırılır. Oysa fleksibil elastik maddeler tüm baskılara dayanabilir ve bunun izini bile taşımazlar. İşte küresel kapitalizmin arzu ettiği fleksibil elastik bireyler bunlardır. Oysa bizim çatlamaya, patlamaya hakkımız vardır diyor Malabou. Onun için beynimizi, bir başka sözü de var onun, beynimizi çevrenin etkisiyle ve deneyimlerimizle kendimiz yaptığımız tezinden yola çıkarak plastisiteyle kendini oluşturmak ve farklılaşmanın bir arada ele alınabileceğini ve dayanma gücümüzün sonsuz olmadığını göstermemiz gerektiğini de vurguluyor. Onun için bu kitabı da Türkçe olarak çıktığında size öneriyorum. Başka bir soru yoksa çok teşekkürler. Bir soru var. Belki son bir soru. Buyurun.
One more.
One more.
You mentioned that we don't have a pleasure drive, actually, but we have a wish to avoid displeasure, or I don't know the word you used. Is it possible that we don't have a death drive, but we want a drive to avoid pleasure? Nothing to do with death. That psychological self-destruction, or perhaps is death a symbolic word for that?
To avoid pleasure.
Yeah. Or just psychological self-destruction has nothing to do with death, or are you using it interchangeably?
Right. If you are right, then you confirm what Freud says, and after all, perhaps this is the last word. Then it means that we find again sadism and masochism, because what you're talking about, like perhaps it has nothing to do with death, but it is just a way of avoiding pleasure. Then Freud is right. But in fact, we cannot really give examples of the death drive. We will always find examples which have something to do with pleasure, like avoiding pleasure, but something to do with pleasure. And at other times, he says, no, the death drive should be totally independent. Otherwise, it wouldn't be the death drive. So the question is open. According to me, I think, and this is what I said in the end, I think that some examples of neurological diseases show that the psyche sometimes behaves itself independently of all forms of pleasure. But this is a question. It's open. Thank you anyway.
Peki, çok teşekkürler hepinize.
Thank you for your
Katılımlara.
questions. Merci pour toi.